The League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, and the focus of this week's topic. If you haven't done so already, you want to make sure you have completed the previous activities about the structure of the United Nations, as this is meant to be the history of why the UN is structured in its current form today. The background to the League of Nations. To start, the League of Nations was set up as a part of the Treaty of Versailles. If you recall, the Treaty of Versailles was that three-part process that ended the First World War, that being the armistice, the Paris Peace Conferences, and then the actual treaty. The League was envisioned to be a truly international organization which would maintain world peace and security by acting together. This was, in a sense, collective security, a concept that is very much enshrined in other organizations today, such as NATO. You may want to check into a textbook on this page for more details. However, the aims for the League of Nations is first, you need to think about what are some important notes about it. One is that when you evaluate whether the League was successful or was a failure, you must look at how much of its aims the League was able to fulfill during its short time, as it existed only in the 1920s and the 1930s. But it was there to promote international cooperation, peace, and security by accepting an obligation not to go to war. The League was to promote open and just honorable relations between the member countries. It was there to lay out a system of what we refer to today as international law. Hence, last week's topic about the International Court of Justice and the other portions or organs that comprise of the United Nations. And also the League was there to maintain or modify any treaties that were being negotiated or had already were in effect between nations. The aims for the League also try to influence aid, labor issues, mandates, collective security globally, what will turn into human rights after the Second World War, minority groups, and health issues. The strengths of the League of Nations was that it was able to deal with social issues such as the improvement of living and working conditions worldwide. It was able to deal with health issues and was able to do very targeted research on curing health diseases such as leprosy. And it set up various commissions that improve living conditions globally for the poorer countries, such as this. However, the League did have some weaknesses. One weakness was dealing with issues with the nations that saw threat to their own security. Also, most members of the League were unwilling to put the security of their nation at risk in order to fulfill their own collective security. In other words, countries, while interested in the League, were still very much interested and prioritized on their own individual security first and foremost. Also, there was various different attitudes towards the League. There was issues about which countries were or were not a member of the League, its mandates that were not always being maintained, and its difficulties in being able to resolve disputes, especially territorial disputes between two or more countries. Now, what I mean about the weakness of the League when it comes to attitudes, it goes like this. Many countries found the peace treaties unpopular, thus they were not willing to accept the League of Nations as a key part of the treaty. Recall, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, in his famous 14 points, had outlined what it will take to create a new world order, a global peace. And that's why World War I was referred to as the war to end all wars. The League was, in a sense, a way to build in that global government and body to ensure the horrors that had occurred along the western or eastern fronts in Europe between the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente powers will never happen again. The idea or words of never again were very much a powerful emotion that existed with many places. However, the League of Nations was not taken seriously by the two most powerful colonial powers, European colonial powers, that being Great Britain and France. Additionally, the Americans, USA was not a member, and so this sent a very mixed signal that the League of Nations was not taken seriously. And if the country that president that came up with the idea of this league could not even convince his own Congress to join this organization, then why should any other country take this concept seriously? Some of you might recall seeing this political cartoon in grade 10 about that same issue there. You may want to pause the video so you can explore this political cartoon. And another political cartoon, once again, you may want to pause the recording to explore, because when you are reading and learning from a political cartoon, you obviously want to think about what's the background, what's the setting, what what forms is a bias, what items are a stereotype, there to ascertain the actual idea. And you can see in this cartoon there are essentially three parts to this cartoon. The Americans on the right with the Star Spangled Banner clothing, the League members wearing all the same kind of European style of clothing with the top hats, and from both sides are looking through the door and seeing issues happening. Other weaknesses that the League of Nations had first was membership. As I said before, USA was not a member. Additionally, Germany, Austria, and Hungary were also not allowed to join because of their extreme resentment towards Germany. While the constant shift of membership as joining and leaving the League was very easy, many countries left because the League opposed their actions or wasn't doing not much to help their own self-interest. Essentially, the League had very little control over its own member states. It was like a club. Other weaknesses the League had was the mandates. They had the right to govern under the control of the League, and the League took over the control of most of Germany's former colonies that had been surrendered at the Treaty of Versailles. Countries, however, holding colonies in the mandate had to help the colonies move to self-government as soon as possible. However, even after 20 years, this was not happening, and many countries who had been in favor of the League had turned against it. Essentially, it was a good idea on paper, was not going to work in reality there. Why? Giving these former colonies a mandate for independence was something that the former American president, Woodrow Wilson, also believed in strongly. The League also had difficulties in resolving issues. The usual form of punishment for disobeying the League was to impose sanctions, essentially not allowing trade between these countries that are in effect. While this method was quite useless because the sanctions hurt trade with other countries, and because the sanctions were removed just as fast as they were implemented. But the League had no force of its own. Well, as we've been looking at the United UN today, the United Nations has a peacekeepers, the blue helmets with the white lettering of UN on it. The UN today has that coercive force, the military force, a force that is provided to the UN by the member countries there. The League, however, did not have this capability. And that's where I'm going to stop talking for a moment, because you can see here there are essentially about 8 different border conflicts that had occurred during the League of Nations mandate before the start of the Second World War. And I categorize them up by which ones were a failure, which had some partial success, and which ones had some full success there. For our sake, I'm not going to go over each one, but I did include the use of pictures for each one of these failures. But a good little strategy, perhaps as a little inquiry activity for you, is to pick a couple of these, two or three, or whatever catches your attention, and do a little inquiry or even like a YouTube video search about it. Each one of these, from the Ruhr to the Apostolasia to the Greek-Bulgarian border dispute in 1925, are all fascinating examples of leftover colonialism or imperialism, nationalism attitudes. And while the history of the 1920s and 30s does seem to get glossed over quite a bit, it is not by any stretch of imagination a boring time. And in fact, it's actually a very interesting time where you can see certain, well, for lack of better words, storylines that happened in the First World War coming to a conclusion, and the background of what would happen in Second World War being set into places. For those who love history, this is where it gets really, really interesting. So, as you saw, I did not provide any details of those. All I provided was an image of each location. You can inquire whichever one interests you the most. So, how do we evaluate, though, the League of Nations? You can basically evaluate based upon its successes or its failures. Now, with the successes, there were social issues such as the improvement of living and working conditions for people in the world, health issues such as improvement of treating diseases such as leprosy or malaria, and the League was able to resolve some territorial conflicts and disputes with its member nations. But the failures, the League was unable to enforce the concept of collective security. It was unable to act as an effective deterrent towards aggressive countries. Attitudes towards the League, a lack of strong membership, the failure of the mandate system for the former colonies to gain their independence, and the ongoing disparities of being able to resolve lingering disputes. Essentially, you can see the successes being in the 1920s and then the failures being roughly around the 1930s. There, dirty 20s, roaring 30s. But how far did the hopes of disarmament succeed there? To start, the concept of disarmament meant dismantling of armies and breaking up of weapons to be in position of making war impossible. Disarmament was a part of collective security because if nations can cut down the use of weapons, the world will be safer there. Collective, you're all in this together, and that's the idea: collective versus individual security. While nations felt that collective security was good, many still wanted their own individual forces to keep themselves protected. Also, by keeping your own individual forces intact, you provide your own people employment, your own industries with work, the industrialization of the factories. There's a lot of individuals of interest that goes with that. Other reasons why countries were not willing to disarm. Great Britain had a fairly large empire, and arguably by the end of World War I, this was the height of the British Empire. One quarter of the Earth's surface was the Union Jack, colored pink. People would answer to the call of the Union there. And so Britain needed an empire and forces to make sure no places would leave the British Empire. And that's before it became, the whole Commonwealth. That's another story. France, refused to do much of the disarmament because they were afraid and anger towards Germany. But while France was not willing to disarm, they were not exactly modernizing their forces either. When war eventually actually broke out for the beginning of the Second World War after the Danzig corridor, France, as an example, was still using solid rubber tires for their cars, and each soldier was only given one clip of magazine. So while they were not willing to disarm, they weren't exactly keeping up to a level of mechanization that Germany, eventually the Nazis, had achieved. And China had a civil war, as we learned about before, between the nationalists and the Kuomintang and the communists, and the civil war in progress and the need to defend China against Imperial Japan's advances. Other reasons for not disarming: Japan was rising in power with their national army and the need to defend Japan against the European colonial imperialist powers in the Asia Pacific. Switzerland even was small and only had big enough to defend their own um, level of neutrality. If you love anything about Switzerland, explore into what Switzerland neutrality really means. They have a fascinating story of what neutrality really means and what is required for the equipment to maintain neutrality. All would say at this moment, for those who are interested, is you will be surprised. And last, Poland. Poland needed to defend the new country, especially from Germany and Russia. So Poland even refused to disarm. This map here shows why Poland was refusing to do any of the disarmament. Now, if recall also, perhaps from the year before, the League of Nations has been said there was three failures. The first was the invasion of Manchuria by Imperial Japan. Second was the disarmament conference, and then third was the fascist Italian invasion of Abyssinia. This is kind of falling in line with the second of those three failures there. Now, German disarmament was supervised by the League. It was, however, slow and took advantage of many loopholes there, and its cut down army as officers so as to secret train others to be ordinary soldiers. They basically saw the loopholes in the writing and knew how to exploit these loopholes. An example of the various weapon piles or weapon caches that eventually the National Socialists, the Nazis, would gain their hands on in their slow rise to power. But what about disarming in the rest of the world? Navy disarmament, because it has been stated and argued that one of the reasons why the First World War happened was because of an arms race. When the very first dreadnought, early version of what can be referred to as a battleship, was built, and from the dreadnought being built, to create an arms race there. And while World War One did have Navy conflicts, such as Jutland as an example, there was not a substantial amount of it, but Navy disarmament was still another key part for the League. The target set down by agreeing to this ratio of shipbuilding between nations was agreed. Tensions, however, between countries was based upon the ratios that they would of how much ships that each country was allowed to have there, as well as proportions were applied to all warships. Everyone could build submarines, but at a very low level there, so it's ambiguously vague. But here's a meeting for the League of Nations. And other things that happened for disarmament around the world. There was a military disarmament in 1932, the Geneva Protocol in 1924, which is oftentimes comes up because nations will agree to bring disputes to arbitration instead of going to war. And then the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was signed by 65 different countries and promised that there will be no war for the next 5 years, except if there will be a war for self-defense. Once again, may take note of the ambiguous language, them signing it. Now, there was also other issues with the League of Nations, and one was the difficulty of the reconstruction and the post-war recovery that the world had faced at the conclusion of the Great War. Now, with the post-war economic problems, there was amount of war damage that had been inflicted upon the country, France being in particular because of where the Western Front was located with those various battles. But there was severe broken trade link damages, industrialization problems, especially in Europe. Communication lines had all been essentially been destroyed, and places had incurred severe amounts of debt. Canada, as an example, had incurred a substantial amount of debt because balancing the budget was no longer the priority. The priority was to win the war, no matter the cost. Now, there was, however, though, a special case, and that was with Germany. Reparations made Germany's economic problems extremely bad after the war, and these economic conditions for Germany became even worse throughout the 20s because the rising of prices, the falling of the wages. Germany had suffered substantial high levels of unemployment. There's extreme levels of discontent. In fact, there was very much a lot of, well, metaphorically, street fights of different groups, different political ideologies. Germany was actually a fascinating case study of different political ideologies from the extreme left wing of the political spectrum all the way to the extreme right wing of the political spectrum for government level there. Germany was in pretty bad shape. And this is on top of the Treaty of Versailles, inflicting Article 231 with the War Guild Clause, the financial reparations, the losing the territory, etc. But also with Germany, the French had essentially invaded the Ruhr area after they had defaulted on the debt. There was strikes by German workers, which made the situation in the Ruhr even more serious. And also the Weimar Republic government was responding to the situation of the Germany's economic by printing more money, which might have seemed like a good idea, but by printing more money, it in fact actually made inflation even more worse, even when there was more Deutschmarks in circulation. An example of how bad it was in Germany, while during the time with the League of Nations, in this photograph, the French troops were sent in to invade the Ruhr. As you see in this photograph, and forced the German workers to go back to work and to continue paying their reparations to France. Um, the economics were bad. Children were using bundles of money as toy building blocks, as you see in this picture. The money was worthless. A housewife using bundles of money to light her stove. In 1923, it cost 200 marks, Deutschmarks, to buy a loaf of bread in Germany. That was the level of an insane, crippling amount of inflation the Weimar Republic had been faced with. Another picture of the situation, the special case with Germany, the Weimar Republic. I think you get the idea, the tacit message with this picture. Now, you might think or ask yourself, what is inflation? In the most simplistic way, inflation is a rise in prices relative to the money that's available. In other words, you can get less money or get less for your money than what you're able to get before. Your buying power is weaker. As an example, you buy a candy car for 50 cents. A year later, you buy the same candy bar, but it's now 60 cents. But you only have 50 cents to buy it. But the prices of the candy bar has gone up. That is inflation. When inflation rises but people's paychecks don't rise, this means that people have less money to spend. on some things. Your buying power has been reduced. Gustav Stroessmann was Chancellor of Germany in 1923. He actually replaced the German mark with the Rentenmark, which is done by reducing the level of government spending. Essentially, it was austerity, which led to improving relations with Germany's enemies, especially once the Treaty of Locarno was signed. And what the Chancellor was doing, Gustav, he actually was awarded Nobel Peace Prize in 1921, or 29, sorry. And recall in 1929, it was also the year of the stock market crash and the beginning trigger of what would be the Great Depression. That is the Chancellor. Stroessmann also had various small reforms. He introduced a Rentenmark. He borrowed money from overseas to increase Germany's confidence in the new currency, which had proper currency back to the new currency. Essentially, it was a way to provide some credibility and to back it up. That's the German mark before and the new one. Stroessmann also in the war was the Germany's most industrialized area, but it was occupied by France after Germany had defaulted on the reparations. Those reparations, the 6,600 billion pounds of reparations that Germany had to pay in the Treaty of Versailles. As a result of this, workers went on strike or worked very slowly, generating next to little amount of profits, and this would continue to harm the German economy. The Chancellor negotiated with the workers and the economy to improve. We also borrow money from overseas to help improve this. But with the collapse of the stock market and the Great Depression, the waves of unemployment, that also be part of the causes of the European currencies to essentially collapse in their value. His reforms was signed at the Locarno Treaty in 1925, which the main point of the Locarno Treaty was that it normalized the relations between Germany, also called the Weimar Republic, and the victorious powers of Great Britain and France. And because of his various reforms he had done, Germany was allowed to join the League of Nations in 1926. He signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. If you're not sure, go back to your previous notes on this PowerPoint, what that was about. And his efforts generally encouraged the United States to produce two plans to cut down the amount of reparations Germany had to pay as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And the United States was even willing to lend Germany money, which unfortunately would exasperate an already critical situation of the American financial banking sector. Now, last but not least, there's the Dawes Plan in 1924. The Dawes Plan with the League was to have Germany to pay less money. And the United States would, in fact, actually lend Germany the money to pay. In exchange, the French troops would leave the war, and Germany would give up um, certain locations for reparations of gold, which allowed to invest and pay off the reparations for it. Profits from the German railways would also be used there. Additionally, there was a Young Plan in 1929, which allowed German reparations cut to 1/4 of the original amount. It lengthened the amount of time that Germany needed to pay in the reparations by 59 years. This was viewed positively because it seemed to be more fair and much more achievable. Recall the Treaty of Versailles, these reparations were supposed to be punitive to punish Germany because of that whole war guilt clause. However, was this entirely feasible? Well, debatable. Despite these two plans, Germany still could not meet the requirements. Most of the borrowed money went into economic recovery programs. Some of the money was funded towards secret plans of rearmament. And when Hitler took the power in the 1930s, the Young Plan, the Dawes Plan were but abandoned by the government. And it's kind of like a house of cards. the borrowing the money from the United States would only work as far as the United States, their own banking would be able to pay for it. But once they started defaulting those loans, it became pretty much a chain reaction to it. So, in summary, while the League of Nations definitely is the predecessor, the precursor, the person I say is more of a progeny towards the United nations today, it does serve a purpose to look at what had happened with the league as a warning from the past and keep that in mind when you learn and study more about the United Nations. While the league ultimately did fail in some of their main goals they wanted to achieve, mainly being collective security, promote world peace there, but as was outlined from the special case study about Germany, what was happening in the 20s before the Nazis and Hitler took the power, the Treaty of Versailles, the various countries that were not part of the League. The United Nations was the second attempt, but it should never be forgotten of what the League was able to achieve and ultimately what the American president, Woodrow Wilson, with his 14 points, had originally envisioned for the world.